The morning sun had barely touched the rocky hills of New Mexico when Martha saw them coming. She stood on her small wooden porch, coffee cup in hand, watching 15 figures move slowly across the desert landscape. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong. These men weren't walking like healthy people. They stumbled and supported each other, their movements telling a story of hunger and exhaustion. Martha Whitehorse was 72 years old and had lived in this remote area all her life. Her small adobe house sat at the edge of Navajo territory, where few people ever passed by. She had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about the old days, when the Navajo people faced terrible hardships. But she never expected to see such suffering with her own eyes. As the men got closer, Martha could see their faces. Their cheeks were hollow, their eyes sunken deep into their skulls. Their clothes hung loose on their thin bodies like fabric draped over wooden frames. Some of them could barely walk, leaning heavily on their companions. The youngest looked to be in his 20s, while the oldest appeared to be around 50. All of them shared the same desperate look of people who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Martha had been widowed for 15 years and lived alone with just her 2 dogs and a few chickens. Her small government check barely covered her own needs, but she had never been able to turn away someone in trouble. Her late husband used to joke that she would give away her last piece of bread to a hungry stranger, and he wasn't far from wrong. The group stopped at her gate, hesitant to come closer. The man who seemed to be their leader, a tall figure with graying hair, raised his hand in a respectful greeting. Martha could see the pride in his eyes even through the exhaustion. These were not men who begged easily. They had probably walked for days before finally approaching her house. "Excuse me, grandmother," the leader said in English mixed with Navajo words. His voice was hoarse and weak. "We are traveling to find work. We haven't eaten in 3 days. Could you spare any water?" Martha looked at the 15 faces staring at her with hope and desperation. She noticed that they only asked for water, not food, though it was clear they were starving. This showed their dignity and respect, qualities that touched her heart deeply. She knew that for proud Navajo men to ask for help from a stranger, their situation must be truly desperate. Without hesitation, Martha opened her gate. "Come in, all of you," she said firmly. "Sit in the shade by my house. I'll get you water and something to eat." The men looked at each other with surprise. They had probably expected rejection or perhaps a small cup of water at best. Instead, this elderly woman was inviting all 15 of them into her yard. Some of them had tears in their eyes as they slowly made their way to the shaded area beside her house. Martha hurried inside, her mind racing. She had enough food for herself for maybe a week, but nothing close to what 15 hungry men would need. In her small kitchen, she looked at her supplies. A bag of flour, some beans, a few potatoes, some canned goods, and the eggs from her chickens. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. She started by filling every container she could find with water from her well. The men needed to drink before anything else. As she carried the water outside, she saw that some of the men had collapsed from exhaustion and were lying on the ground. Others sat with their backs against her house, too tired to even lift their heads. "Drink slowly," Martha advised as she moved from man to man with the water containers. "Your bodies aren't used to having enough right now." While the men drank, Martha went back inside and began cooking everything she had. She mixed flour with water to make simple bread dough and put it in her small oven. She started a large pot of beans cooking on her stove, added the potatoes she had, and opened every can of food in her cupboard. She even went outside to gather eggs from her chickens, apologizing to them as she took every single egg they had laid. The smell of cooking food drifted outside, and Martha could see the men's faces change. Hope began to replace the emptiness in their eyes. Some of them tried to stand up to help her, but she waved them back down. "You rest," she told them. "You'll need your strength for whatever comes next." As the food cooked, Martha learned more about the men's situation. They had been traveling for weeks looking for work in the copper mines or on ranches. A drought had made farming impossible on their reservation, and many families were struggling to survive. These 15 men had left their homes to find jobs and send money back to their wives and children. But work was hard to find, and their money had run out days ago. They had been surviving on wild plants and whatever water they could find, but the desert was harsh and unforgiving. When they saw Martha's house, it seemed like a miracle, the first sign of hope they had encountered in their desperate journey. Martha brought out the first batch of bread while the beans continued cooking. She watched as the men shared it carefully among themselves, making sure everyone got an equal portion. Even in their hunger, they maintained their sense of community and fairness. This impressed Martha greatly and confirmed her decision to help them. As the afternoon wore on, Martha served them everything she had cooked. She watched with satisfaction as color began to return to their faces and strength to their movements. The men ate slowly and gratefully, thanking her repeatedly in both English and Navajo. The leader of the group, who told her his name was James Begay, pulled Martha aside as the sun began to set. "Grandmother, we can never repay your kindness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have saved our lives today. We will remember this forever." Martha smiled and patted his arm. "You would do the same for me," she said simply. "That's what people do for each other." As darkness fell, Martha brought out blankets and told the men they could sleep in her yard for the night. She had given them all her food and had nothing left for tomorrow, but she didn't worry about that. Somehow things would work out. That night, as she lay in her small bed listening to the quiet conversations of the men outside, Martha felt a deep satisfaction. She had done the right thing, even though it meant she would probably go hungry herself in the coming days. But as she drifted off to sleep, she had no idea that her simple act of kindness was about to set in motion events that would change everything. The next morning, Martha woke to the sound of quiet voices and movement in her yard. She looked outside and saw that the 15 men were already awake, sitting in a circle and talking softly among themselves. The food and rest had clearly helped them recover some strength, though they were still far from healthy. Martha put on her old cotton dress and walked outside to greet them. James Begay stood up respectfully as she approached, and the other men followed his example. In the morning light, she could see their faces more clearly. These were hard-working men, weathered by sun and wind with calloused hands that spoke of years of manual labor. "Good morning, grandmother," James said. "We were discussing our situation. We know you gave us all your food yesterday and we cannot ask you for more. We will continue our journey today." Martha looked at their thin faces and shook her head firmly. "You're not strong enough to travel yet," she said. "Besides, I may not have much food, but I can make something. Sit down and tell me about your families while I figure out breakfast." The men reluctantly sat back down, and Martha went to examine what little she had left. In her small pantry, she found some cornmeal and a bit of lard. It wasn't much, but she could make corn cakes. She also had some coffee beans that she had been saving for special occasions. If this wasn't a special occasion, she thought, nothing was. As she prepared the simple meal, the men began to share their stories. Joseph Yazzie, a man in his 30s with gentle eyes, told her about his 3 young children back on the reservation. His wife was pregnant with their 4th child, and they had no money for the birth or for food. "My little daughter, she's only 4 years old," Joseph said, his voice breaking slightly. "Before I left, she asked me when I would bring food home. I promised her it would be soon, but now—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Thomas Benelli, an older man with gray streaks in his black hair, spoke about his elderly mother who lived with him and his wife. "She raised 7 children after my father died young," he said. "Now she can barely walk and we can't afford her medicine. I thought if I could find work in the mines, I could send money home for her treatment." One by one, each man shared his story. There was Robert Nez, whose family farm had failed after 3 years of drought. His corn had withered in the fields and his sheep had died from lack of grass. Samuel Yazzie told about his teenage son who was sick with tuberculosis and needed medical care they couldn't afford. Charlie Begay, the youngest of the group at 22, had left behind his new wife and infant son. "I got married only 6 months ago," he said, tears in his eyes. "My son was born just before I left. I've never been away from them before, but there's no work on the reservation. Nothing at all." As Martha listened to these stories while cooking, she felt her heart breaking. Each man carried the weight of his family's survival on his shoulders. They weren't traveling for adventure or personal gain. They were desperate fathers, sons, and husbands trying to save the people they loved. The stories continued through the morning. Frank Tsozi told about his disabled brother, who couldn't work and depended on Frank's income. David Silversmith, a skilled craftsman, explained how the market for traditional Navajo jewelry had disappeared, leaving him with no way to use his talents to earn money. Henry Yazzie, one of the quieter men in the group, finally spoke about his daughter who had shown great promise in school. "The teacher says she's smart enough for college," he said proudly. "But we can't even afford books for her regular classes now. I wanted to earn enough money to keep her in school, maybe even send her to the university someday. Martha served the corn cakes and coffee, watching as the men shared everything equally despite their hunger. Their stories had painted a picture of a community in crisis, where families were being torn apart by poverty and lack of opportunity. The drought had been the final blow to an already struggling economy on the reservation. As they ate, Martha learned more about the conditions they had left behind. The trading posts had closed because people had no money to buy goods. The few jobs that existed went to younger men, leaving the older workers with no options. Many families were surviving on government commodities that were often spoiled or insufficient. We heard there might be work at the copper mine near Silver City, James explained. It's still 2 days' walk from here, maybe 3 in our condition. But we had to try. Our families are counting on us. Daniel Nez, a man in his 40s with a kind face, showed Martha a small photograph he carried in his pocket. It was a picture of his wife and 5 children, ranging in age from 3 to 16. This is why I keep walking, he said simply. When I look at their faces, I can't give up. The photograph was passed around the circle, and Martha saw how each man looked at it with recognition and understanding. They all had similar pictures in their own pockets, similar reasons for enduring this difficult journey. As the morning progressed, Martha noticed something remarkable about these men. Despite their desperate circumstances, they maintained their dignity and cultural values. They treated her with deep respect, calling her grandmother in the traditional way. They shared everything equally among themselves and spoke with reverence about their families and their Navajo heritage. Our grandfathers would not recognize the world we live in now, said William Begay, an elderly man who seemed to be the group's spiritual leader. But they would still expect us to take care of our families and maintain our honor. That's why we walk this hard path. Martha found herself deeply moved by their strength and character. These were not broken men despite their circumstances. They were warriors in their own way, fighting poverty and hardship with determination and unity. Their love for their families gave them courage to continue when most people would have given up. By midday, the men insisted they had to continue their journey. They had rested for almost 24 hours, which was more than they had hoped for. The corn cakes and coffee had given them some energy, and they knew that every day they delayed meant another day their families went without help. Martha watched them prepare to leave with mixed feelings. She wanted them to stay longer, to rest more and eat better, but she also understood their urgency. Somewhere out there, children were waiting for their fathers to return with food and hope. As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to say goodbye, James Begay approached Martha one more time. "Grandmother," he said formally, "you have given us more than food. You have given us hope and reminded us that there are still good people in the world. We will carry the memory of your kindness with us always." Martha hugged each man goodbye, pressing a small package of corn cakes into James's hands for their journey. As she watched them walk away across the desert, growing smaller in the distance, she whispered a prayer for their safety and success. She had no way of knowing that this would not be the last time she saw these men, or that their story was about to take a turn that would surprise everyone involved. 3 weeks after the 15 men left Martha's house, something unexpected happened. A young Navajo man on horseback arrived at her gate, asking if she was the woman who had fed the hungry travelers. His name was Peter Yazzie, and he was the nephew of Joseph Yazzie, one of the men in the group. "My uncle sent word back to our family," Peter explained, dismounting from his horse. "He told everyone about your kindness. The story has spread across our entire reservation. People are talking about the elderly woman who gave everything she had to help strangers." Martha invited Peter inside for coffee, curious about news of the men she had helped. She had wondered about them many times since they left, hoping they had found work and could help their families. Peter shared what he knew. The men had indeed reached the copper mine, but there were no jobs available. However, word of their situation had reached a ranch owner who needed workers for the cattle roundup. All 15 men had been hired, and they were finally earning money to send home to their families. "But that's not why I'm here," Peter continued, his voice growing serious. "The story of what you did has become something bigger than just helping those men. People on our reservation are saying that if an elderly woman living alone could share everything she had, then we should be doing more to help each other." Martha listened with growing amazement as Peter told her what had happened after the story spread. Families who had been struggling alone began sharing their resources with neighbors. Women started cooking community meals to make sure no children went to bed hungry. Men organized work groups to help repair homes and tend to the livestock of families whose breadwinners had left to find jobs. "Your example started something," Peter said. "People remembered the old ways when our communities took care of everyone. We had forgotten how to do that, but your story reminded us." Peter had brought gifts from several families on the reservation. There were hand-woven blankets, turquoise jewelry, and baskets filled with traditional foods. But more importantly, he brought an invitation. "The tribal council wants to honor you," he explained. "They want to hold a ceremony to recognize what you did. Many families want to meet you and thank you personally. Would you consider coming to our reservation for a few days?" Martha had never been formally honored for anything in her life. The idea made her nervous, but she was also curious about the reservation and the people she had heard so much about. After thinking it over for a day, she agreed to go. The following week, Peter returned with a truck to take Martha to the reservation. As they drove through the landscape of red rocks and sparse vegetation, he told her more about how her story had affected people. There was an old woman named Mary Begay who had been too proud to ask for help, Peter said. Her roof was leaking and she was sleeping on wet ground every time it rained. After hearing your story, her neighbors came together and fixed her roof without being asked. He also told her about a family with 7 children whose father had been injured and couldn't work. The community organized shifts to help his wife with the children and brought food every day until he recovered. They said if Martha Whitehorse could feed 15 strangers, they could certainly help their own neighbors. When they arrived at the reservation, Martha was overwhelmed by what she saw. Despite the obvious poverty, there was a sense of community and mutual support that she had never experienced before. Children ran freely between houses, confident that any adult would care for them. Elderly people sat in the shade, surrounded by family members who clearly respected and valued them. The ceremony took place in the evening under a large ramada, a traditional shelter made of wooden posts and brush. Martha was surprised to see that hundreds of people had gathered. Families had traveled from distant parts of the reservation to meet the woman whose story had inspired their community. James Begay and several of the other men she had helped were there, having returned from their jobs specifically for this ceremony. They looked healthier and stronger, and their faces glowed with pride and gratitude. Each man introduced Martha to his family, and she finally got to meet the wives and children she had heard so much about. Joseph Yazie's 4-year-old daughter, the one who had asked when Daddy would bring food home, shyly approached Martha with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thank you for helping my daddy," she whispered, then ran back to hide behind her mother's skirt. The tribal council chairman, an elderly man named Robert Nez, stood to address the gathering. "Sometimes," he said, "it takes an outsider to remind us of our own values. This woman, Martha Whitehorse, showed us what it means to share without counting the cost. She gave food to hungry men not because they were Navajo, but because they were human beings in need." One by one, people stood to share how Martha's story had affected them. A young mother told how she had started a food-sharing program for families with small children. An elderly man described how neighbors had come together to help him repair his truck, which he needed to drive his sick wife to medical appointments. A teenage girl stood up nervously and said, "Before I heard this story, I thought being poor meant being ashamed. But Martha showed us that what matters is not how much you have, but how willing you are to share it. Now I'm proud of my family and my community." The stories continued late into the evening. People talked about gardens they had started together, tools they shared, and children they helped raise collectively. The community had rediscovered the strength that comes from unity and mutual support. As the formal ceremony ended, people began to approach Martha individually. Women brought her gifts of food and handmade items. Men offered to help with repairs to her house or any other work she might need done. Children, encouraged by their parents, came forward to shake her hand and practice their English by saying, "Thank you." But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when an elderly woman named Annie Yazie, who was introduced as one of the community's most respected elders, took Martha's hands in hers. "Sister," Annie said, using the traditional form of address between women of equal status, "you have shown us that the spirit of our ancestors lives on. In the old days, no one went hungry as long as anyone had food. You reminded us of this truth, and our community is stronger because of it." Martha spent 3 days on the reservation, visiting with families and learning about Navajo culture and traditions. She was amazed by the richness of their heritage and the strength of their community bonds. Despite facing significant economic challenges, these people had maintained their cultural identity and their commitment to taking care of each other. When it was time to leave, Martha felt like she was saying goodbye to family. The relationship she had formed in just a few days felt deep and meaningful. She had arrived as a guest being honored for her kindness, but she left feeling like she had received far more than she had given. As Peter drove her home, Martha reflected on what she had experienced. Her simple act of sharing her food with hungry men had somehow sparked a renewal of community spirit across an entire reservation. People who had been struggling alone had remembered the power of working together. "You know," Peter said as they neared her house, "this is just the beginning. Word about what happened here is spreading to other reservations too. People are starting to talk about the importance of helping each other again." Martha smiled as she looked out at the familiar landscape surrounding her small house. She had always believed that one person could make a difference, but she had never imagined that her difference could spread so far or touch so many lives. Little did she know that the ripple effects of her kindness were about to expand far beyond what anyone could have imagined. 2 months had passed since Martha's visit to the reservation, when something completely unexpected happened. A knock at her door early one morning revealed a well-dressed man in his 50s holding a notebook and camera. He introduced himself as David Martinez, a reporter for the Albuquerque Journal newspaper. "Mrs. Whitehorse," he said respectfully, "I've been hearing an amazing story about you, and I'd like to write an article about what you did. Would you have a few minutes to talk?" Martha was surprised and a bit nervous. She had never spoken to a newspaper reporter before, and wasn't sure why anyone would want to write about her. She invited David in for coffee and listened as he explained how he had learned about her story. "I was doing a series of articles about poverty on Native American reservations," David said. "When I visited the Navajo reservation last week, everyone I talked to mentioned your name. They told me about how you fed 15 hungry men, and how that act of kindness started a whole movement of community support." David had spent several days on the reservation, documenting the changes that had taken place since Martha's story spread. He had interviewed families who were now sharing resources, community leaders who were organizing cooperative programs, and children who were learning traditional values of generosity and mutual aid. "What struck me most," David continued, "was that people didn't just tell me about receiving help. They told me about how good it felt to help others. Your example seemed to unlock something in people, a desire to be part of something bigger than themselves." Martha shared her version of the story, explaining that she had simply done what anyone would do when faced with hungry people. She was amazed when David told her about all the changes that had resulted from that one morning when she shared her food. The newspaper article appeared the following Sunday on the front page of the regional section. The headline read, "Elderly Woman's Simple Act of Kindness Transforms Native American Community." The article told Martha's story and described the remarkable chain of events that had followed. Martha didn't think much more about the article until her phone started ringing. The first call came from a radio station in Santa Fe, asking if she would do an interview. Then a television station from Albuquerque called. Soon, reporters from newspapers in Denver, Phoenix, and even as far away as Los Angeles were contacting her. The story seemed to strike a chord with people across the Southwest and beyond. In a time when news was often filled with conflict and negativity, Martha's story offered something different, proof that individual kindness could create real change in the world. Within a week, letters began arriving at Martha's small house. The first few came from people in New Mexico who had read the newspaper article. A retired teacher from Santa Fe wrote to say that Martha's story had inspired her to volunteer at a local food bank. A businessman from Albuquerque enclosed a check for $100, asking Martha to use it to help others in need. But the letters kept coming, and they weren't just from New Mexico. People from all over the country had somehow heard about Martha's story and wanted to share how it had affected them. A farmer from Iowa wrote about starting a program to share surplus crops with hungry families in his community. A group of women from Texas had organized a neighborhood support network for elderly residents living alone. The most touching letters came from other elderly people who'd been inspired by Martha's example. A 78-year-old man from Oregon wrote that he had started visiting homebound neighbors and bringing them groceries. An 80-year-old woman from Florida had organized other retirees to help struggling families in her community. As the weeks went by, the letters multiplied. Martha's kitchen table was soon covered with mail from across the United States and even from other countries. A family in Canada had read about her story online and started a food-sharing program in their neighborhood. A group of students in England had organized a fundraiser for hungry families after being inspired by her example. Martha was overwhelmed by the response but also deeply moved. She had never imagined that her simple act of sharing food could inspire people thousands of miles away to help others in their own communities. Each letter seemed to carry the same message. Martha's story had reminded people of the importance of helping those in need. The most surprising development came when Peter Yazzie arrived at her house one afternoon with news from the reservation. "Martha," he said with excitement, "you're not going to believe what's happening. People from all over the country are sending donations to help our community. They say they were inspired by your story." The tribal council had received thousands of dollars in donations from people who had heard about Martha's kindness. The money was being used to start new programs: a community garden to provide fresh food for families, a tool lending library so people could share equipment, and a fund to help people start small businesses on the reservation. "But it's not just about the money," Peter explained. "Groups from other communities are sending volunteers to help with projects. A church group from Colorado is coming next month to help build houses. A medical clinic from Arizona is organizing free health screenings. People want to be part of what you started." Martha listened in amazement as Peter described how her story had connected people from different backgrounds and locations in a shared mission of helping others. The 15 hungry men she had fed had become symbols of human dignity and the power of compassion to create change. The attention continued to grow. Martha was invited to speak at churches, community centers, and even at a university. Though she was nervous about public speaking, she agreed to share her story because she hoped it might inspire others to help people in need. At her first speaking engagement, a community center in Santa Fe, Martha faced an audience of more than 200 people. She told the simple story of the morning when 15 hungry men appeared at her gate, how she shared her food with them, and how that led to changes she never could have imagined. "I didn't do anything special," Martha told the audience. "I just did what my grandmother taught me to do. When someone is hungry, you feed them. When someone needs help, you help them. It's that simple." The response was immediate and powerful. People in the audience wiped away tears as Martha spoke. After her presentation, many came forward to tell her about ways they planned to help others in their own communities. A local businessman announced that he would start a program to provide job training for unemployed people. A group of teachers said they would organize tutoring programs for struggling students. Several families pledged to volunteer at local soup kitchens and homeless shelters. As Martha drove home that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had gone from being an unknown, elderly woman living quietly in the desert to someone whose story was inspiring people across the country to acts of kindness and service. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was that the story continued to grow. Each person who heard about Martha's kindness seemed to find their own way to help others, creating an ever-widening circle of compassion and community support. Martha realized that she had become part of something much larger than herself, a movement that proved one person's kindness could indeed change the world, one act of generosity at a time. It was early spring, nearly 6 months after Martha had first helped the 15 hungry men, when something extraordinary happened. She was tending to her small garden behind the house when she heard the sound of many vehicles approaching. Looking up, she saw a convoy of trucks and cars creating dust clouds as they traveled across the desert toward her home. Martha walked to the front of her house, shading her eyes against the bright sun to get a better look. As the vehicles got closer, she could see they were filled with people. Her heart began to race with worry. Had she done something wrong? Was there some kind of trouble? The first truck stopped at her gate and a familiar figure stepped out. It was James Begay, the leader of the 15 men she had helped. But he looked completely different now. He wore clean clothes and had gained weight. His face was bright with health and happiness. Behind him, Martha recognized several of the other men from the group, all looking strong and well-fed. Grandmother, James called out with joy in his voice. We have returned, and we have brought friends. As more vehicles arrived and people began getting out, Martha realized this was unlike anything she had ever seen. There were men, women, children, and elderly people. Some were obviously Navajo, but others appeared to be from different tribes and backgrounds. Everyone was carrying bundles, baskets, and containers. Joseph Yazzie, the man with the 4-year-old daughter, approached Martha with his entire family. His wife carried a beautiful blanket, and his daughter, now noticeably taller and healthier than when Martha had seen her photograph, held a bouquet of desert flowers. Mrs. Martha, the little girl said clearly, having practiced the words, "Thank you for helping my daddy. Now we want to help you." More people kept arriving until Martha's small property was filled with what appeared to be hundreds of visitors. Children ran around excitedly while adults organized themselves into groups. Martha noticed that people were setting up what looked like a camp, with tents and cooking areas. Thomas Benally, the man who had worried about his elderly mother, came forward to explain what was happening. "Martha," he said with deep emotion in his voice, "after you helped us, our lives changed completely. We found work. We sent money home to our families, and we never forgot what you did for us." He gestured toward the crowd of people who had arrived. "These are our families, our friends, and people from communities across the Southwest who heard your story. We have all come together to do something for you." Martha looked around in amazement. She estimated there were at least 300 people in her yard, and spilling out into the surrounding desert, representatives from multiple Native American tribes had made the journey. Along with Hispanic families, Anglo ranchers, and people from various towns and cities, Robert Ney, the skilled craftsman, stepped forward carrying a large leather bag. "We have been planning this for months," he said. "Everyone you see here has contributed something. We want to build you a new house, a bigger house worthy of your generous heart." Martha was speechless. She looked at her small, aging adobe home where she had lived alone for so many years. The roof leaked in several places. The walls needed repair, and the plumbing was unreliable. But she had never complained because it was her home. "You don't need to do this," Martha finally managed to say. "I'm fine in my little house." An elderly Navajo woman named Sarah Yazzie, who appeared to be one of the leaders of the group, took Martha's hands. "Grandmother," she said gently, "you fed our hungry men when you had barely enough for yourself. You shared everything you had without asking for anything in return. Now it is our turn to give." Over the next hour, Martha learned about the incredible organization that had gone into planning this event. People had traveled from as far away as Colorado, Arizona, and Texas. Construction workers had volunteered their time and expertise. Others had donated materials, food, and supplies. A Mexican-American contractor named Miguel Santos explained the construction plan. "We have enough materials and workers to build you a beautiful new house in just 4 days," he said proudly. "It will have 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a large kitchen, and a covered porch where you can sit and watch the sunset." The children in the crowd had their own special project. Led by Charlie Begay, the young man who had left behind his new wife and baby, they had prepared a garden area where they would plant vegetables, fruit trees, and flowers. "So you'll always have fresh food and beauty around your home," Charlie explained. As the day progressed, Martha watched in wonder as the most remarkable community project she had ever witnessed began to unfold. People worked with incredible organization and efficiency. Some groups cleared and prepared the construction site while others set up cooking areas to feed all the workers. Women from different tribes and cultures worked side by side, preparing enormous amounts of food. Traditional Navajo fry bread cooked alongside Mexican tamales and American barbecue. Children from various backgrounds played together, quickly overcoming language barriers through the universal language of games and laughter. The men began the foundation work for the new house, with experienced construction workers teaching skills to volunteers who had never built anything before. Martha noticed that people weren't just working on her house. They were also forming friendships and connections across cultural and geographic boundaries. As evening approached, someone had organized a community celebration. Musicians brought guitars, drums, and traditional flutes. The sound of music filled the desert air as people from different cultures shared their songs and dances. Martha found herself seated in a place of honor, watching families she had never met celebrate together in her yard. A young Apache woman sang a traditional blessing song while elderly Navajo men drummed. Hispanic children performed folk dances they had learned from their grandparents. Anglo families clapped along to music they had never heard before but somehow understood. Samuel Yazzie, the man whose son had been sick with tuberculosis, approached Martha with wonderful news. "My boy is healthy now," he said with tears of joy in his eyes. "We were able to afford his medicine because of the work we found after you helped us. He's here tonight and he wanted to meet you." A teenage boy, tall and strong-looking, came forward shyly. "Thank you for saving my father and his friends," he said respectfully. "Because you helped them, they could help me get well. Now I want to be a doctor so I can help other people." Story after story emerged throughout the evening. Henry Yazzie, the man who had worried about his daughter's education, proudly introduced Martha to his daughter, who had indeed continued her schooling and was now planning to attend college. Frank Tsosie's disabled brother was there, healthier and happier because the family could now afford proper care for him. But the stories weren't just about the original 15 men and their families. People who had never met Martha before shared how her story had changed their lives. An Anglo rancher from Arizona explained how he had started a program to provide job training for Native American youth. A Hispanic family from Colorado had organized their community to support elderly neighbors living alone. A group of college students from New Mexico had driven 8 hours to be part of the construction project. Their leader, a young woman named Lisa, explained their connection to Martha's story. "We read about what you did in our sociology class," she said. "Our professor used your story as an example of how individual actions can create social change. We wanted to see for ourselves and be part of it." As the evening continued, Martha realized that the gathering had become something much more than a construction project. People were forming connections that would last long after the house was built. Business cards and phone numbers were exchanged. Plans were made for future collaborations between communities. A Pueblo elder named Antonio shared his perspective on what was happening. "In the old days," he said, addressing the entire gathering, "different tribes would come together for important ceremonies and trading. Tonight feels like those ancient gatherings. We are different peoples, but we are united by the same values, helping others and taking care of our communities." Children who had never left their home communities were learning about different ways of life. Adults were discovering that people they had thought were different from them shared the same concerns about family, work, and community. Language barriers dissolved as people found ways to communicate through gestures, shared work, and common purpose. Martha was particularly moved by a conversation she had with Maria Santos, the wife of the contractor who was leading the construction project. "My husband and I have been married for 30 years, Maria said, "and we've always tried to teach our children to help others. But sometimes it's hard to know how to make a real difference. Your story showed us that it doesn't take a lot of money or special skills. It just takes a willing heart." As the night grew late, people began to settle down in their tents and sleeping bags scattered across Martha's property and the surrounding desert. The sound of quiet conversations in multiple languages created a gentle murmur that gradually faded into peaceful silence. Martha lay in her old house for the last time, listening to the sounds of hundreds of people sleeping nearby. Tomorrow they would begin building her new home, but she realized they were also building something else: connections between communities, friendships between strangers, and hope that individual kindness could indeed create lasting change. She thought about the morning 6 months ago when she had seen 15 hungry men walking across the desert toward her house. She had simply shared her food with them, never imagining that this act would eventually bring hundreds of people together in a celebration of community and mutual support. As she drifted off to sleep, Martha smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring not just the beginning of a new house, but the continuation of something even more valuable. Proof that kindness, once shared, grows and multiplies in ways no one can predict or control. Martha woke before dawn to the sound of movement and quiet voices outside her house. Through her small window, she could see people already stirring in their temporary camps. The construction crew was preparing their tools, and women were starting cooking fires to prepare breakfast for everyone. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to greet the early risers. The desert air was cool and fresh, and the first light of dawn was painting the eastern mountains in shades of pink and gold. It promised to be a beautiful day for the construction project to begin. James Begay approached her with a cup of coffee and a warm smile. Good morning, grandmother. We wanted to start early to make the most of the cool morning hours. By midday, the desert sun will be too hot for heavy work. Martha accepted the coffee gratefully and looked around at the organized activity beginning all around her property. People were moving with purpose and efficiency, clearly following a well-planned schedule. She was amazed by the level of organization and cooperation among so many people from different backgrounds. As she sipped her coffee, Martha noticed something in the distance that made her gasp. On the horizon, silhouetted against the brightening sky, she could see more figures approaching. At first, she thought it might be another group of construction volunteers arriving late. But as the figures came closer, Martha realized this was something entirely different. These weren't trucks carrying supplies or families with camping equipment. These were people on foot, walking in a long, organized procession across the desert landscape. Joseph Yazzie, who was helping to organize the morning meal, noticed Martha staring toward the horizon. He followed her gaze and then called out to the others in excitement. "Look, they're coming!" Just like the messenger said they would. People throughout the camp began to stop their work and turn toward the approaching procession. Children climbed on top of trucks to get a better view. Adults shaded their eyes against the rising sun, trying to count the figures walking toward them across the desert. As the procession drew nearer, Martha could see that it was even larger than she had first realized. There were hundreds of people walking in organized groups carrying banners and what appeared to be ceremonial items. The morning light revealed the colorful patterns of traditional clothing from many different Native American tribes. Thomas Benally came to stand beside Martha, his voice filled with awe. "Word of what we're doing here spread to reservations across the entire Southwest," he explained. Traditional leaders from dozens of tribes decided this was something they needed to witness and be part of. Martha watched in amazement as the procession approached her property. She could now see that the walkers included people of all ages, from elderly tribal elders to young children. Some carried traditional drums, others held carved staffs or sacred bundles. Many wore ceremonial dress that represented their specific tribal heritage. The leading group stopped at the edge of Martha's property, and an elderly man stepped forward. He was clearly a person of great respect and authority, wearing traditional regalia decorated with eagle feathers and intricate beadwork. His presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the camp. "I am Thomas Standing Bear," he announced in a voice that carried clearly across the gathering. "I speak for the Intertribal Council of the Southwest. We have walked through the night to be here at dawn, because what happens here today is important for all our peoples." Martha felt overwhelmed by the solemnity of the moment. She had no idea what protocol was appropriate for greeting such an important gathering of tribal leaders. But Thomas Standing Bear solved her uncertainty by walking directly to her and taking her hands in his. "Grandmother," he said with deep respect, "your story has traveled on the wind to every reservation, every pueblo, every tribal community in this region. What you did for 15 hungry men has reminded all our peoples of the old ways, when communities took care of each other without counting the cost." He gestured toward the hundreds of people who had walked through the night to reach her property. "These are representatives of 43 different tribes and communities. We have come to witness this house building, but more importantly, we have come to honor you and to participate in what you have started." Martha looked out over the sea of faces now surrounding her small property. The original 300 volunteers from the previous day had been joined by what appeared to be at least 1,000 more people. Her tiny homestead had become the gathering place for one of the largest intertribal assemblies anyone could remember. Samuel Yazzie, standing nearby with tears in his eyes, whispered to Martha, "In all our tribal histories, there are stories of great gatherings when different peoples came together for important ceremonies, but none of us alive today have ever seen anything like this." Thomas Standing Bear continued his formal address. "Your simple act of sharing food has grown into something sacred. It has reminded us that despite our different languages and customs, we are all related. We are all part of the same human family." The crowd of tribal representatives began to organize themselves into a large circle around the construction site, where Martha's new house would be built. Martha realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, a spontaneous intertribal ceremony that had grown out of her small act of kindness months earlier. Drums began to beat in rhythm, and singers from different tribes took turns offering traditional songs of blessing and gratitude. The variety of languages and musical styles was incredible. but somehow they all blended together into a unified expression of community and celebration. Charlie Begay, the young man who had left his new wife and baby to find work, approached Martha with his family. His wife carried their infant son, who was now old enough to look around with bright, curious eyes. "Martha," Charlie said with emotion in his voice, "my son will grow up hearing the story of this day. He'll know that his father was saved by a generous woman whose kindness brought all these peoples together. This will be part of our family's history forever." As the morning progressed, Martha learned that the tribal leaders had brought more than just their presence to the gathering. Each group had contributed something to the construction project: skilled craftsmen, traditional building materials, artwork and decorations for the new house, and ceremonial blessings for the project. A Hopi master craftsman had brought traditional pottery and tiles to decorate the new house. Navajo weavers had created special rugs and blankets. Apache woodworkers had carved decorative elements from local trees. Pueblo artists had prepared beautiful painted designs for the walls. But perhaps most importantly, the tribal elders had brought their wisdom and perspective on what Martha's story meant in the larger context of Native American culture and values. Robert Nez, the silversmith who had been one of the original 15 hungry men, served as a translator as different elders shared their thoughts about the significance of the gathering. An Apache grandmother says that Martha represents the best of the old ways, Robert translated. She says that in ancient times no one would let a stranger go hungry, no matter how little they had for themselves. A Pueblo elder added, "This gathering shows that the traditional values are not dead. They were just sleeping, waiting for someone like Martha to wake them up again." As Martha stood in the center of this incredible gathering, watching hundreds of people from dozens of different communities working together to build her a new home, she felt deeply moved by the realization that her simple act of sharing food had somehow connected her to something much larger than herself. The sun was now fully up, and the serious work of construction was about to begin. But Martha knew that what was happening here was about much more than building a house. It was about building bridges between communities, rekindling traditional values of generosity and mutual support, and proving that individual kindness could indeed change the world in ways no one could predict. As the sun rose higher in the desert sky, something truly remarkable happened. The morning light revealed that the overnight procession Martha had witnessed was only the beginning. Across the entire valley, as far as the eye could see, people continued to arrive. They came in pickup trucks and old cars, on horseback and on foot, in church buses and family vans. The sound of vehicles and voices created a constant hum of activity that echoed off the surrounding hills. Martha stood on a small rise near her house, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening around her. Thomas Standing Bear approached her, his weathered face showing amazement even though he had helped organize much of the gathering. "Grandmother," he said, shaking his head in wonder, "we expected maybe 500 people to come for this house-building ceremony. But look around you. There are thousands here, and more are still arriving." Martha looked out across the valley and felt her heart racing with emotion. The landscape was filled with people representing what appeared to be every culture and community in the Southwest. She could see Navajo families setting up traditional hogans, Hispanic families preparing outdoor kitchens, Anglo-ranching families organizing supply stations, and urban volunteers from cities across the region working alongside rural residents. James Begay, the leader of the original 15 hungry men, climbed up to where Martha was standing. His voice was thick with emotion as he tried to explain what he was witnessing. "Martha," he said, "in our Navajo language, we have a word, hozo, that means living in balance and harmony with all things. What you started 6 months ago when you shared your food has created hozo on a scale none of us have ever seen before." As the morning progressed, Martha learned that the gathering had grown far beyond what anyone had planned or expected. Word of the house-building project had spread through social networks, church congregations, community organizations, and tribal councils across multiple states. People who had heard Martha's story had decided they wanted to be part of what was happening. A group of college students from the University of New Mexico had driven through the night to participate. Their leader, a young man named David, explained their motivation. "We're studying community development and social change. When we heard about this gathering, we realized we were seeing history being made. We wanted to be part of it, not just read about it in textbooks." Martha met a family who had driven from as far away as Oklahoma. The father, a Choctaw man named William, told her, "My grandmother always said that when something this important happens, you don't ask questions about convenience or cost. You just go." So we packed up the kids and drove all night. The construction project itself had evolved into something unprecedented. What had begun as a plan to build Martha a simple 3-bedroom house had transformed into a massive community effort involving dozens of skilled craftsmen and hundreds of volunteers. Miguel Santos, the contractor who had originally planned the house, was now coordinating work crews that included master builders from multiple cultural traditions. "We're not just building a house," he explained to Martha. "We're creating a structure that represents the best of all our building traditions." The new house was being constructed with adobe techniques learned from Hispanic craftsmen, log work taught by Anglo ranchers, stone masonry shared by Pueblo builders, and decorative elements contributed by artists from dozens of tribal communities. The result would be a unique structure that truly represented the multicultural community that had come together to build it. But the house construction was only one of many projects, happening simultaneously across the valley. Martha discovered that people had organized themselves into work groups tackling various community improvement projects. One group was building a community center where people from different backgrounds could meet regularly to maintain the connections formed during this gathering. Another team was creating a large community garden that would provide fresh food for families throughout the region. A group of educators had set up a temporary school where children from different cultures could learn from each other while their parents worked on construction projects. Martha watched in amazement as Navajo children taught Hispanic children traditional games, while Anglo children shared their knowledge of desert wildlife with Native American kids. The most remarkable sight was the constant stream of food being prepared and shared freely among all the thousands of people in the valley. Cooking fires and outdoor kitchens dotted the landscape, with families from every cultural background contributing their traditional foods to a massive, continuous feast. Martha found herself being led from group to group, meeting people who had traveled incredible distances just to shake her hand and thank her for inspiring them to action. A grandmother from Phoenix told her about starting a neighborhood support network for elderly residents. A group of teenagers from Denver had organized fundraising events to help homeless families in their community. Perhaps the most moving encounter came when Martha met Elena Rodriguez, an elderly Hispanic woman who had driven from Texas with her entire extended family. Elena took Martha's hands and spoke to her in Spanish, with her granddaughter translating. "My grandmother says that your story reminded her of her own grandmother, who used to feed anyone who came to her door during the Great Depression." The young woman translated, "She says you proved that the spirit of our ancestors is still alive in people today." As the afternoon wore on, Martha realized that the gathering had taken on a life of its own. People weren't just building her house and then planning to leave. They were creating something permanent, a network of relationships and commitments that would continue long after everyone returned to their home communities. A group of tribal leaders had organized a formal ceremony to mark the significance of the gathering. Thomas Standing Bear explained that they wanted to create a permanent record of what had happened, so that future generations would know about the day when thousands of people came together because one elderly woman had shown kindness to hungry strangers. As the sun began to set on this extraordinary day, Martha stood once again on the small rise overlooking the valley. The sight took her breath away. Thousands of people were scattered across the landscape, all united by a shared commitment to helping others and building stronger communities. Campfires were beginning to twinkle like stars across the valley floor. The sound of music, laughter, and conversation in dozens of languages created a symphony of human connection that filled the desert air. Children ran between the camps, making friends across cultural boundaries that their parents had once thought insurmountable. James Begay joined Martha on the hill, along with the other 14 men she had helped 6 months earlier. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the incredible scene below them. "Martha," James finally said, "when we walked up to your house that morning, we were just 15 hungry men hoping for a drink of water. We had no idea we were about to meet someone who would change thousands of lives." Thomas Benelli added, "In our tradition, we believe that some people are born to be bridges between worlds. You are that kind of person, Martha. You built a bridge between cultures, between communities, between people who thought they had nothing in common. As darkness fell and the valley filled with the warm glow of countless campfires, Martha reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been an unknown elderly woman living alone in the desert. Tonight, she was surrounded by thousands of people who considered her family, all because she had shared her food with hungry strangers. The new house was nearly completed, but Martha knew that the real construction project was just beginning. The people gathered in this valley were building something much more important than walls and roofs. They were building a movement based on the simple idea that kindness, once shared, could grow and multiply until it transformed entire communities. Tomorrow, people would begin the journey back to their home communities, but they would carry with them the memory of this gathering and the knowledge that individual acts of kindness could indeed change the world. Martha's simple act of sharing food had proven that one person's generosity could inspire thousands of others to become warriors of kindness in their own communities. As she prepared to spend her first night in her beautiful new house, surrounded by the sounds of thousands of people celebrating the power of human compassion, Martha smiled with deep satisfaction. She had learned that the greatest gift anyone can give is not money or possessions, but the willingness to share what they have with those in need. And sometimes that gift comes back multiplied beyond anything anyone could ever imagine.